Hey guys, welcome to the Minor Prophets podcast, and we are working through the Sermon on the Mount. So, as John Mark mentioned in the first video, we're going to be dividing up, some of these different messages, and as we work through the Sermon on the Mount, it is especially when you're going through any kind of deconstructing or reevaluating what you believe and why you believe. I found the Sermon on the Mount to be an incredibly clarifying message that it really seems to help with determining what truth is, identifying truth, and to bring clarity when things get confusing, and the waters of kind of what we believe and why we believe it get muddy. A couple of things about the Sermon on the Mount before we kind of dive in is so we find the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7, and we also find a similar report in Luke's Gospel in Luke chapter 6. There's two schools of thought on this, and I'll give my own kind of opinion on it. One school of thought is they are two different tellings of the same story, and that is not the view that I personally adhere to. The other view is that Jesus told different variations of the same sermon in different settings, and that's the view that I hold to. And let me show you why. Okay, so here we see Matthew 5, and then I've also got Luke 6 pulled up in a different tab over here. And my Logos Bible study is updating. So first is the Sermon on the Mount. One, it's on a mount. It's on a mountain. So we see Jesus, he goes up on the mountain. In Luke 6, Jesus actually comes down. So he was on top of the mountain. He chooses the 12. He spends his time in prayer. He comes down to a level place. That's where the crowd is that he then starts to speak to. So this one is often referred to as a sermon on the plain in Luke 6. A couple of other distinctions between the two. In Luke 6, we have Jesus who is standing and ministering. So there's a large crowd, a great multitude of people from all of Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon who had come to hear him and be healed of their diseases. Those who were troubled by unclean spirits were being cured, and all the people were trying to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. And he raised his eyes towards his disciples and began saying, "Blessed are you." So he starts this while power is emanating from him, and in the middle of a ministry time, he is speaking a condensed version of a similar message. This is how I view it. And whether you view it as differently, either way, in this telling, it's not that he has a captive audience. It's people are coming to him for ministry, and in that he is ministering both through his speech to his disciples, and power is emanating from him, and people are being healed simultaneously in the Luke 6 telling. Matthew 5, he goes up on the mountain and he sits down. So he's not standing up and people are approaching him for healing. We don't have that in the Sermon on the Mount. So and there's a handful of different distinctions between the two messages, and I wanted to kind of point to this difference first because by comparing the two, it can actually help to have a more full picture of what is being communicated. And there are differences. For example, just as a good starting point, the first thing that he says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." What does it say in Luke 6? He doesn't say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He says, "Blessed are you who are poor." Now, they both get the same reward. Yours is the kingdom of God. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A different language, same meaning. Poverty of spirit is an awareness of my own need of God, right? So it doesn't necessarily correlate to poor in the natural. Jesus actually says in the Sermon on the Plain, he says, "Blessed are blessed are you who are poor. So there's a blessing for physical poverty. So there is a difference between the two. Also, in the Sermon on the Plain, there is a whole portion that is not found in the Sermon on the Mount, the woes. So it's worth noting those differences where so that you can kind of get a full picture of what's being communicated by Jesus in these two different messages is how I view it as two different messages. And the reason I say that is I like to start at the end, and some of this is going to be a little bit repeat as John Mark hit on this in the first recording. So Jesus says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, he will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and its collapse was great. Okay. Now, before I add any kind of commentary to this, I want to flip over to Luke and kind of show one of the ways that it actually gives a more complete picture. So, again, he says, everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I'll show you whom he's like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And when there was a flood, the river burst again against that house, yet it could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation, and the river burst against it, and it immediately collapsed, and the ruin of the house was great. Okay, a couple of points in here. First, Sermon on the Mount, it's a storm. And the Sermon on the Plain, it's not a storm, it's a river. But the main thing I wanted to point to is the digging deep. He's like a man who dug deep. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you build, which either in the example from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, everybody who is in the audience has heard these words, but that alone is insufficient. It's going to take effort. That you are going to have to build on the rock. In the Sermon on the Plain, it says he's one who digs down, who actually does the work to dig down to get to the rock. So it's not just choosing where you build, right? So it's not choosing between I'm going to build on a rock or I'm going to build on sand. It's not like the two are right next to each other. It's that one of them takes effort. Either way, there's a layer of sand on top. If you just start building on the sand, that is going to be the failed foundation. But if you dig down, if you do the work of not just hearing the words, but making the effort to make the changes to your life, then and build your life on those words. Which words? The words that he preaches in the Sermon on the Mount. If we take the words of the Sermon on the Mount and we build our lives on those words and do the effort of making sure that that we are not just being casual in our approach to the Sermon on the Mount, of just hearing it, but that we actually make changes in our lives because of it. And this is one of the challenges that we have right now in the charismatic, I believe, where we want to hear the new thing, but we have so many things that we don't apply. And because we don't apply them, we don't see changes in our life. And when things come against us, we're not ready for it. Now, there's a difference between the storm and the river. It's interesting to note that when Jesus talks about the storm, first, everybody gets the storm. Everybody gets the river. Everybody gets opposition that comes against them, whether you want it or not. So this notion of life is just going to be perfect and I'm not going to have any issues if I'm if I'm a Christian and if I go to church and I just listen to the messages, or if I just listen to God, that alone is sufficient by hearing. And here we have a clear example where it's not just the hearing, it's hearing and obeying. It is meant to change the course of our lives. And the change is actually for our benefit. And the thing that reveals what we've been building on is how we respond in the midst of the trial, right? So the rains fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. That when the testing came, the thing that revealed the foundation was the storm. The storm reveals the foundation. How we respond when adversity comes reveals how much of our lives have been built on the truth of what Jesus said. Storm comes either way. So this idea of, I'm not going to have any issues is pretty easily negated just by the simplicity of this verse. Now, I do think it's interesting, and I think you can draw too many conclusions from this, but I think it's interesting that Jesus actually says, rain fell, floods came, and winds blew. So it is not just a single testing. It's that there is a testing of every aspect of the house. So it's, the roof is tested through the rain, the winds testing the walls, the floods testing the foundation. And that's when you identify it. It's not just a singular form of testing. Every aspect of our lives are going to be tested in some capacity. And whether it be external factors, things of, circumstances that come against us, people that come against us, is going to be, so circumstances, it's going to be relational, and then it's also going to be within the context of family and every aspect of our lives is going to be tested in some capacity. And it's something that we actually forget in kind of this modern era of maybe just the charismatic, where it's almost like we forget that God tests us. God allows and orchestrates circumstances that test us. And in the testing, it reveals how and where we've been building and how much we trust him. A good verse that kind of speaks to that is Proverbs 17, verse 3. The refining pot is for silver, the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. God does testing. Now, I once had I'll call it a vision, that was, I was in prayer, and it was an internal vision. So think of it in terms of your sanctified imagination. I was in prayer, and I saw myself looking through a window of a house, and it was a beach house. And I could see over the ocean. I could see a storm over the ocean. And I could see that this storm was slowly moving my direction. And I looked around. I'm looking at this house, and I had been praying about a certain church community at the time. And I had noticed the walls were nice. Everything in the house looked pristine and perfect. But when I looked down at my feet, it was like if you've ever been on a boardwalk going out to the beach, where there's the wooden slats that are just sitting on the sand. That's what the foundation of the house was. And I immediately knew I needed to get out of there. So I get out, and I looked up the hill, and there was a house that was of lesser appearance, but it was on a rock. So I went up to the lesser house, less. How would I describe it? Not as illustriously designed house, but it was a simple home. and it was on the rock. And when the storm came, I knew I was fine. I think that in many ways that is a allegory for certain things in the church too. I believe that that's not the context that Jesus is saying when he's saying you build your life. The house is your own life. This is also a reason for, if you're doing any kind of prophetic interpretation or dream interpretation, that homes often mean your way of life. This is meant to be the foundation for our lives, which is pretty significant. If you think about it, we have in the Sermon on the Mount a full sermon of Jesus, and he says this one sermon is sufficient to build your life on.